Hey, everybody. For those of you who tuned in last week, you probably recognize me. My name is Donna Clements. I work for the Produce Safety Alliance. I'm based down in Riverside, California. And today I was asked to talk about the use of untreated and treated soil amendments, or what we call biological soil amendments of animal origin, in the FSMA produce safety rule. And this talk today is really going to be a follow-up of what we introduced last week. So for those of you who listened last week, we talked quite a bit about kind of the risk of using soil amendments from a foodborne pathogen standpoint. We talked a little bit about treated versus untreated soil amendments. As I was saying, last week we introduced a little bit about the risk. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is take a lot of the discussion that has happened so far in today's webinar and kind of try to loop it into how it relates to the Food Safety Modernization Act produce safety rule. So again, a very quick refresher, in the federal regulation, in the produce safety rule, FDA took the approach of separating the regulatory status into two different categories. And so the produce safety rule is pretty much establishes the category of an untreated soil amendment versus a treated soil amendment. And we talked a lot more about untreated soil amendments last week. Those are things like manure is probably the most commonly used untreated soil amendment. And really for the next bit, I'm going to really focus on treated soil amendments. But I would be remiss if I didn't quickly mention what the application intervals are for anybody using an untreated soil amendment. And just a reminder, I'm really focusing here on the requirements in the FSMA produce safety rule. Just keep in mind, if there's any growers listening in who did not catch last week's session, we consider the produce safety rule to be baseline standards. So Brian talked and John talked a lot about California specific requirements. Keep in mind, I'm sharing these federal regulation requirements with you. So for those of you who are selling to the leafy greens market or have other buyer requirements, I would just look into what your specific requirements might be, particularly if you are using untreated soil amendments such as manure. But I wanted to share with you, if anybody is using untreated soil amendments on their produce for growing produce, currently the FSMA produce safety rule does not have an established application interval. So when we say application interval, that's going to be the interval or the number of days between applying that soil amendment and harvesting the crop. So right now, if you look at the federal regulation, there's a big giant reserved under it. And FDA is pursuing additional research. And but currently the recommendation is to use the National Organic Program intervals. And those are commonly known as a 90 and 120 day rule. So waiting at least 90 or 120 days prior to harvest, depending on whether the crop harvests or depending on whether the crop contacts the soil. And then also very importantly, untreated soil amendments must be applied in a way that minimizes contact with produce. So that's really all I'm going to discuss here on untreated soil amendments. And now I'm going to kind of switch gears because this is the composting section. I'm going to switch gears and talk about treated soil amendments. And I wanted to introduce this, that in the FSMA produce safety rule, they really establish two different microbial standards. And the requirement is that soil amendments that are considered treated must conform to one of these standards. So they don't have to conform to both of them, just one of the standards. And the first standard is no detectable Listeria monocytogenes, Salmonella species, and E. coli 0157H7. So if you think about some of your purchased soil amendments, things like heat-treated poultry pellets, some of your more processed soil amendments, there's a good chance that those soil amendments would meet this microbial standard. No detectable Listeria, Salmonella, and E. coli 0157H7. The second standard that is established in the produce safety rule is no detectable salmonella species and fecal coliforms less than 1,000 CFU in 1 gram or 1 milliliter. And this is a standard that I believe it was Brian referenced a little bit earlier, that when any of you are working with compost, so compost that's treated via windrow or aerated static system, that's what Brian discussed earlier, and John also mentioned it. These compost processes are essentially, they do meet that second standard. And those are the photos that I have on the right. On the top, I have some heat treated poultry pellets. And then the second photo is a aerated static system, a little bit smaller than the photos of the system that Brian showed in his presentation. But the reason I'm sharing with these two microbial standards with you are it essentially, these standards kind of help identify how the grower can use the compost on the farm. So if any of you, any growers in the audience, have a treated soil amendment that is treated to this first standard, again, that's at no detectable, and then there's a couple of pathogens listed there, that soil amendment can be applied in any manner with no restrictions. So they consider that to be a little bit stricter of a soil amendment treatment, and therefore it can be applied in any manner. That second standard, which would include compost such as windrow compost or aerated static compost, the requirement for using this in a produce operation would be to minimize potential contact during and after application. And when I say minimizing potential contact, that's going to be things like minimizing any contact between the compost and the actual harvestable part of the crop. So for example, if you're growing bush tomatoes or really any produce item. And I want to mention that both soil amendments that meet either standard technically have a 0-day application interval. And from a produce safety standpoint, that's one of the benefits of using a treated soil amendment, right? They've gone through that high heat, that aerated step, they've been composted. So we can assume that the pathogens have died off through that treatment step. So one of the benefits is technically having a 0-day application interval. And you'll notice I keep saying technically because from a recommendation standpoint for produce safety, we still highly recommend applying a time interval. So I would still not recommend to growers that even if a compost or a treated soil amendment is used, I would still recommend having some number of days between applying that soil amendment and harvesting the crop. And in this slide, I kind of just wanted to visually reference what Brian and John mentioned in their presentations, that the two scientifically valid composting methods in the produce safety rule are turned or windrow composting and aerated static composting. And the time temperature turning, that process measurement is the same as what John talked about earlier. So the minimum number of days, minimum temperature, and then the minimum number of turnings are in alignment with the CalRecycle and EPA standards. So in the FSMA produce safety rule, the FDA did not reinvent the wheel there. Now, I saw in some of the pre-submitted questions, there were a couple of questions referencing blood meal, fish emulsion, and some of the, what I'll say, alternative soil amendments. So oftentimes when we talk about compost and treated soil amendments, we end up really focusing on compost. But in a lot of agricultural production, we see some of these alternative soil amendments being used, like bone meal, blood meal, fish emulsion. And I think in one of the questions they asked about how do some of these soil amendments fall under the produce safety rule requirements. And the same microbial standards that I discussed in the previous slides, they would still apply to these soil amendments. And essentially, the requirement is that the soil amendment meet one of those standards that was established in the rule And if they don't meet one of those standards, then it would be considered an untreated soil amendment. So in the same category as like a raw manure. And I will say, just from working with different types of soil amendments, a lot of these processed commercial products do meet one of those standards, whether it's the first standard I talked about with no detectable Listeria, Salmonella, or E. coli 0157H7, or that second standard that's more akin to like a composting. Okay, and I wanted to add a couple of slides in here that talk about curing, because I know John referenced it in his pre-recorded presentation. So in the FSMA produce safety rule, it talks a lot about what the different treatment standards are. And when it introduces composting, it lists out those minimum temperature, the turning, and those process requirements. And then it says, and followed by adequate curing. And we often get the question of, what is curing? So in this slide, I kind of introduced this concept of curing. So it's often considered the last stage of compost. So it happens after that active composting stage. And it essentially allows the product to continue maturing. So this is going to be more of a passive process. It's a nice buffer area. So if the active composting, maybe it's still not quite finished, maybe it's still losing temperature, it's getting down to some of those mesophilic temperatures. But it is a critical step, because this helps ensure that compost is stable. And in the previous presentation, John talked a little bit about immature compost. And one of the things that we're trying to address with curing is prevent the use of immature compost. So of course, because I'm talking about the produce safety rule, the reason we're concerned with curing is that we want to make sure that those pathogens have died off, so that the compost would be considered a treated soil amendment. But for production reasons, one of the other reasons we want cured finished compost is because those nutrients can help stabilize, like John talked about previously. So having a cured compost can help prevent off-gassing, nutrient runoff, and again, from a production standpoint, it can also help minimize burning of plants. So you don't want to apply an immature compost to very tender plants where some of the roots can get burned. But again, in terms of the produce safety rule, we're really looking at curing for produce safety reasons, to make sure that the compost is stabilized and that it has those pathogens have died off. So a couple of suggestions or keys for an effective curing process. A lot of times it's kind of sit back and wait. It is a very passive process compared to the active steps of turning and monitoring that we've done previously. So the piles are going to be generally smaller in the curing stage, because we want to make sure that there's a passive or natural air exchange. So often for larger operations, the recommendation is a maximum of 6 to 8 feet. And I think that's still quite large. But again, the idea is to allow that aeration naturally of the composting piles. In my previous presentation last week, I talked a little bit about storage and handling recommendations. So a lot of those recommendations would still apply. Making sure that piles are stored in a well-drained area, because this is still considered an aerobic process. So we want to allow that natural air exchange to occur and really try to get those beneficial microorganisms. And then curing may be complete when the temperature of the pile falls to near ambient temperatures. So previously we talked about thermophilic composting, right? So we want that compost to heat up, like we talked about previously, but in the curing stage, we're letting it slowly come back down to cooler mesophilic temperatures. And like John mentioned in his presentation, the curing, a lot of this compost is going to be very dependent on your particular operation. But a guideline that is often given is to allow curing to happen for like 1 to 4 months. And again, it's going to sort of depend on if that compost was still active when it reached that curing stage. Okay. The other thing I wanted to briefly talk about in this presentation was vermicomposting. And there were a couple of questions that I saw in the pre-submitted comments. So here I wanted to introduce, for anybody not familiar with vermicomposting, it's essentially worm composting. So it's allowing earthworms and microorganisms to break down the feedstock into what is called vermicompost or vermicast. I see vermicomposting used much more on smaller farms. So urban farms, they have a smaller footprint. And there are some benefits to using vermicompost, very similar to traditional compost. So improving soil aeration and drainage, increasing water retention. I know Margaret talked about this a little bit earlier. And the last thing I want to mention here is that we're still waiting on a lot of data for what does vermicomposting mean in terms of produce safety. So science shows that the process of vermicomposting, so starting off with a feedstock, it might be manure-based, it might be vegetative or green waste-based, but the process of using worms to break down the feedstock, it may kill pathogens. We're still kind of, the jury is still out, and we are still waiting on the results of some of these studies. But the process of vermicomposting is not a thermophilic process. So one of the reasons that we know composting is effective is that, the piles heat up, and a lot of these human pathogens do not survive well at high temperatures. They're much better at those lower temperatures, like human body temperatures. And then also that heat process, it gives us something to measure in the process of composting. We can take the temperature and we say, okay, we know this aerobic process is working. But we think that there might be some data out there to show that vermicomposting is effective in different ways. So pathogen reduction can be due to other factors: mechanical grinding, enzymatic digestion, microbial competition. It just works slightly different than in aerobic composting. That said, what does it mean in terms of produce safety? I mentioned that there is still research being conducted. One of the big focuses I've seen on this research is how can the vermicompost process be standardized? So for example, how many worms, like what density, how long does the treatment have to last, and how can we measure this to monitor and make sure that the process is effectively reducing pathogens? So under the FSMA produce safety rule, as it currently stands, vermicompost is considered an untreated soil amendment because it has not been shown yet to meet those two microbial standards, or one of the two microbial standards that I shared with you before. But we are still waiting to see the results of some research that's ongoing. So in terms of the produce safety rule, I have seen growers use a vermicomposting process and then following it up with a different compost process, such as a thermophilic treatment, but that is quite a bit of additional work. But I just wanted to share with you how it currently falls under the produce safety rule. And then the last thing I wanted to share with you as I wrap this up is the documentation requirements for soil amendment use. And I shared this slide in my previous, in last week's presentation as well. But there is a fact sheet that we developed on documentation requirements for commercial soil amendment suppliers, because so many of the smaller growers I work with, they actually purchase their treated soil amendments or their compost from elsewhere. So we developed this fact sheet that it's a page front and back with an additional page that includes a template certificate of conformance. And it's essentially designed to be printed and handed off to a compost supplier that may not be very familiar with the requirements in the produce safety rule. So in terms of those documentation requirements, there's actually no required documentation for an untreated soil amendment currently. I do expect that to change. when the minimum application intervals are put into place. But right now, the only documentation requirement for soil amendments is for treated soil amendments, such as a compost. And the requirement there is that records have to be kept of the composting treatment process. And that would be monitoring the process, right? So monitoring the time, temperature, turnings. And this is exactly what is required in organic certification. And it sounds like it is very similar to what Brian talked about is required for California regulations. I will say one of the big differences here is that there are no testing requirements for compost or for soil amendment treatment in the produce safety rule. So if the process has met one of those microbial standards I shared with you, then you can assume that it is okay, it's good to go. So there's no end product testing required in the FSMA produce safety rule. And then if the compost is purchased, then it must have a certificate of conformance provided by the seller. And that's introduced in that fact sheet that I shared with you. And I'll drop the link in the chat box as well. Okay, so with that, I just wanted to thank, a lot of these slides were developed in conjunction with a organic research and education initiative project. And I will also leave my contact information. I'm Donna Clements, so there's my email address and my phone number if anybody has follow-up questions.